This is Whiskey Lore. To those who had heard the tales of Rochambeau and the mighty French fleet that brought down the British at Yorktown just a few years earlier, the harbor at Brest, France on this cool December morning must have seemed like the perfect recreation. And it seemed altogether fitting that the target of all this activity would once again be His Majesty King George III's redcoats. There sat some 43 vessels slowly sailing their way past Pont du Diable, or Devil's Point, on into the Celtic Sea with Irish liberation on their minds. And for the 33-year-old Irishman who had helped lobby the French government for this military flotilla, one can only imagine the tremendous feeling of pride and excitement that must have come over him. The man knew that his brothers in arms in Belfast, Dublin, Wexford, and throughout his homeland were standing at the ready. What a glorious sight it would be, seeing a swarm of French ships on the horizon beyond the beautiful green cliffsides and rocky coast of County Kerry and County Cork. In the mind of this dreamer patriot, December 16, 1796 seemed destined to be a day long remembered in the annals of Irish history. And it's all because this coachmaker's son had seen fit to carry the cause of Irish independence on his very capable shoulders. As a youth, Theobald Wolfe Tone was a dreamer. Tales of the sea, a fascination with military maneuvers, and the activities of the Dublin garrison seemed to crowd out of his mind all the normal pleasures of a young man. And to those that knew him, few likely saw him heading towards a career in law. Yet he would find his way to the bar after studying at Trinity College. And it was during his time there that he would fall in love with a beautiful 16-year-old girl named Martha. The two would elope, and she would take on his pet name for her, Matilda. After Wolfe's father's coachmaking business went bankrupt, the happy young couple would take up residence in his home. Now, during his time as a barrister in Dublin, Wolfe Tone would make fast friends with an army ensign named Thomas Russell. Russell was a native of County Cork in the south, and he would share many political beliefs with Tone, and even though they didn't hold the same level of religious passion, it never seemed to get in the way of their friendship. Now, Tone's religion would be shaped by his family. They were members of the Anglican Church, but he had descended from Huguenots, Protestants that had escaped religious persecution in France. And perhaps awareness of this persecution is what made him acutely aware of the plight of the non-Anglican ascendancy, the Irish majority that had no power in the Irish Parliament or in the courts. And during a time when Tone was becoming more politically aware, he learned of Captain Cook's discovery of islands in the Pacific. And at once he put together plans for a military colony for one of the chains of islands, Hawaii. And he sent his plans off to William Pitt the Younger, Prime Minister of Great Britain, with great hopes of taking hold of those islands before the Spanish had a chance to move in. Yet Pitt never responded. It wasn't long after this that Tone began contemplating England's dominance over his home country. He decided to bring together a group of politically curious men to discuss the feasibility of Irish independence from British rule. The members included his friend Russell, along with William Drennan, William Johnson, and others. For Tone, he was beginning to believe that Ireland could only be happy if it was an independent nation. Now, his fascination with religion would inspire him to write a paper called An Argument on Behalf of the Catholics of Ireland. It was inspired by the 1782 return of power from England to the Irish Parliament. that didn't quite include the level of Catholic or non-Anglican emancipation that Tone felt appropriate. He wanted to make his voice heard on the subject, and his paper drew the favorable attention of the Catholics. And meanwhile, his allies Russell and Drennan had moved north to Belfast, and Tone decided it was time to take his Catholic alliance and merge it into an alliance with the Protestants of the North, maybe with a little help from his friends. He was beginning to believe that the only way that he could win equal representation of all of the people was with a unified Ireland, an Ireland free from religious sectarianism. With this in mind, he would gather his friends together and form a secret organization known as the Society of the United Irishmen. But when war broke out between Britain and revolutionary France, the society didn't stay secret for long. The Crown was looking for ways to tamp down on revolutionary ideas in Ireland, and the revolutionary ideals of the society would soon catch their attention. And meanwhile, the Catholics would start to separate from the United Irishmen as they felt the group was moving closer and closer to the radical dechristianizing French. And Tone saw cracks as well as he thought about the difficulty of overcoming the Protestant ascendancy in the Irish Parliament. But regardless of the feelings of the Catholics, he knew the French would be the best path towards independence, and they would need their support if they were ever going to succeed. It was around this time that Tone Wolfe met with an Irish preacher who had spent some time living in revolutionary France. Reverend William Jackson had grown quite interested in Tone and his plans for independence, and he started asking questions about the Irish commitment to a revolution. He thought it possible he might be able to get the French to join the fight. Of course, this was music to Tone's ears, but he cautioned the Reverend that he needed to be careful about revealing their discussions, especially to his assistant, Cockayne, who Tone thought might be spying for the British. Well, it turns out that Tone's hunch was right, and Jackson's loose lips found him in court on charges of treason. Wanting to protect his family from losing their inheritance if he was convicted, Reverend Jackson secured a vial of arsenic. He took it before entering the courtroom, and then dropped to his knees in agony in front of the jurors and died in front of them. With no go-between between France and the Irish revolutionaries, Tone then decided it was time to take his family to America so he could attempt to find an ally that could get him an introduction to members of the French Directory. As he arrived in Belfast before boarding the boat, he met with his comrades at Cave Hill and urged them to, quote, never desist in our efforts until we subvert the authority of England over our country and asserted our independence, unquote. But aboard the ship Cincinnatus, bound for Philadelphia, Tone's ship would be overtaken by the British and boarded. And in the height of the war against the French, the British had begun boarding ships and impressing any of the able men into the British military. 50 men from the Cincinnatus were captured and herded onto the British vessel, and Tone would only escape thanks to the tears and desperate pleas of his wife and sister. For the Irish rebel, it would be the closest of calls. Once they reached Philadelphia, Tone would find the connection he was looking for. He also discovered he wasn't really a fan of what the Americans were doing with their hard-fought freedom. He felt they'd only given up the chains of a system built on class to exchange it for one built on wealth. He had no interest in staying, and instead looked forward to his voyage to Paris. Known under his codename Citizen Smith, Tone would find revolutionary France much more to his liking. After lobbying the French Directory, he would work tirelessly to convince the French of the Irish desire for a rebellion against the English. His plan was to utilize the French Navy in the same way the American colonists had used the French fleet under Rochambeau. He reassured them of his countrymen's commitment to see the battle through, and for the French, who were still at war with the British, this seemed the perfect opportunity to spread their revolution to British shores and to create chaos in London. To Tone's delight, the plans were approved. To get things started, Tone was put in touch with one of France's most skillful and ruthless commanders, General Lazare Hoche, and Tone himself would join the French military as an adjutant general. And on that fateful day in December of 1796, those 43 ships and around 14,450 men would go from Brest, France, headed for the shores of Ireland. But if the men feared attack from the British, well, that wasn't to be. Instead, they would find nature as their enemy. And soon, a gale arose, putting the men's nerves on end. The path to Bantry Bay in County Cork would be clear of British obstacles, but the French would seem incapable of landing ashore with such rough seas. Wolfe Tone's agitation would grow stronger by the day as the boats continued to bob and weave offshore. Any element of surprise was going to be lost, and the revolutionaries on shore were being left to fend for themselves. And to Tone's horror, days later, the French would give up and turn their ships back to France. The chance was lost. Tone would sail again under the Dutch Vice Admiral Jan de Winter, but again storms would delay the mission, and it would hold him up just long enough for the British to catch sight of them. And in the fierce sea battle at Camperdown, the Dutch fleet was defeated. Meanwhile, in Ireland, the rebels had planned to take Dublin, yet many of the rebellion's leaders were arrested in Leinster. Seems the British had led a successful counterinsurgency. Then uprisings in County Down and County Antrim fizzled, and at Wexford, the insurgents would see greater success, but eventually would fail, with some escaping into the Wicklow Mountains and others being forced to surrender. And any hope Tone had of another grand fleet soon dissipated as his ally General Hoche passed away from consumption, and Napoleon Bonaparte seemed more interested in Egypt than in Ireland. But eventually a couple more missions were sent north, and fittingly, Tone would join the mission headed by the French ship Hoche. But unfortunately for Wolfe Tone, the boat would be captured off the coast of Donegal at Buncrana. He would be taken to Letterkenny and placed under arrest. Any hope of a grand French victory and helping hand in Irish independence was soon lost. But during his court-martial in Dublin, Tone wouldn't back down, especially knowing he was likely being put to death. Defiant to the last, he suggested that all he wanted was to meet his enemies, quote, in fair and open war to produce the separation of the two countries, unquote. His last request was that the court should adjudge me to die the death of a soldier, and that I may be shot. That decision was handed to the Lord Lieutenant, who denied it and sentenced him to hang. And it was here that the seeds of a grand mystery would be planted. It seems that while in custody awaiting his fate, Wolfe Tone would die in prison after a knife slit his throat. But did he slit his own throat in an apparent suicide? Or was it slit for him by his British captors? Either way, it would take 8 days before Wolfe Tone succumbed to his wounds. To add to the mystery, years later, a military surgeon who had attended to Tone before his death said that around this time he had treated a man with an odd neck wound, where apparently a bullet had passed through the man's throat. Was he speaking of Wolfe Tone? As for Tone's hoped-for revolution, that would die out around the same time he did. Not long after, negotiations would begin with the British, and on January the 1st, 1801, the dream of an independent Ireland free to rid itself of religious persecution was lost in the Acts of Union, which officially bound his country to the newly formed United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The Irish Parliament would be dissolved. As for Thomas Russell, he would be arrested and would spend 6 years in prison. Upon his release, he would go to Paris and scheme again for Irish independence. But his schemes would be discovered, and he'd be arrested again once he came back to Dublin, was found guilty of high treason, and executed in October of 1803. As for Tone's darling Matilda, well, she would live on in America and live almost another 50 years. And she'd always hold a torch for her husband, hoping to keep his name alive. Back in Ireland, many future generations would see him as the father of Irish republicanism. Now you may be asking, why am I telling this story? And what does it have to do with whiskey? Well, nothing really. Yet, the story of the Irish Rebellion is critical to the understanding of future stories about Ireland, as this was a very pivotal time in the country's history. But I did actually find one odd whiskey connection. Apparently, one of Tone's supporters was a man named John McManus, and he would experience the hanging fate that Tone had escaped. Now, some say he was hanged because he was breaking curfew, but others say it was because of his association with Tone's United Irishmen. Well, John McManus is the son of mhaith McManus, who was the man who founded the distillery at Kilbeggan. And word abounds that John's ghost still haunts the distillery, unable to rest because of his unjust hanging. In fact, in 2007, a TV host named Derek Acora brought his show Most Haunted to the site of the distillery to attempt to confirm the existence of a spectral being, and it said that he met the ghosts of John Locke and mhaith McManus. However, apparently he didn't meet with John. Yet, give it time, these are just two of several ghosts that the distillery claims. So more ghost hunters are sure to investigate. Well, it was Friday the 13th, and while some might consider that unlucky, I tend to think, everybody else is sucking up all the bad karma. I'm going to have a good day. And actually, this was the day I was supposed to be in Belfast, walking around with McConnell's brand ambassador, Sarah Kennedy. It was a day she probably didn't think really was going to happen because, of course, sometimes people will say, oh yeah, if I'm ever in town. Well, little did I know that I was going to be visiting 44 distilleries around Ireland and making this an extra stop on my journey. Our meetup was set for around 10 a.m. at a cool little whiskey shop and bottle museum called A Friend at Hand. I'd slept in as long as I could, having not gotten back to my Airbnb until after 3 a.m. the night before, after my crazy little walk. The chirping birds and the sun beaming in the window at 7 a.m. threw me right out of bed. If I wanted to sleep, it wasn't going to happen. I spent the morning wandering around Belfast looking for some landmarks around town and trying to find an ATM to get some more Ulster pounds in my pocket. And after a hearty breakfast, made my way over to the whiskey shop. Now, Belfast was an interesting place for me to go visit. Seems the only time I ever heard about it was in regards to the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, and all the troubles that were going on there. And I have to say that I'm one of those people that got caught up in the discussion of it being a war zone rather than being a place to go visit. And so I never really considered visiting until Sarah and I started talking during our interview, and I was like, man, this sounds really interesting. I mean, I come from a town that has a rough past also, Detroit, and, you know, for people who move away from places like that, and this is definitely true for the Motor City, whenever somebody says something bad about the town or is like, why would you want to go there? There's this thing inside of me that goes, it's not that bad. It's not that bad. A place like that gets into your soul and you really start to want to defend it across the globe. And so I see that same sort of thing going on. I mean, Detroit now is all about bicyclists going around town, foodies, and urban explorers. So it was kind of fun to hear Sarah talk the same way and have that same sense of pride in talking about her hometown. Well, I arrived at a friend at hand a little bit early, and the amiable man in charge was rolling deep into a sales pitch with a traveler extolling the virtues of Irish whiskey. It was fun listening to him kind of walk the person into an understanding of Irish whiskey and to listen for what different whiskeys he was pointing out. I could almost hear my own inner dialogue just with the few distilleries that I'd been to, thinking, man, why don't you tell him this one? And why don't you tell him this one? After the man left, we started to chat a little bit about some of the historic bottles that he had in the shop. And I couldn't help it. I was still in that mode of wanting to obsess over whether there was an E in whiskey or not. I don't always let go of things as easy as I should. And that's when I spotted the bottle of Redbreast 16, the one that I'd had the night before over at the Duke of York. A $300 bottle of whiskey. Wow, but it was good. And then I turned around, and there in the doorway was Sarah with a handful of McConnell's marketing materials. Looked like she was going to get some work accomplished while we were going on our tour. She pointed out the old McConnell's bottles. It was fascinating to look at them. The new ones really do mimic the old bottles, except for, as she pointed out at the bottom, the medicinal recommendations, which I don't think would pass by the modern legal system. When we walked outside, she solved my mystery of the day before, the word Bushmills on the side of the building across the way. Apparently this used to be an old bonded warehouse for Bushmills, and they also had their offices down here in these alleys. She told me that the whole area had been quite run down for a long time, but was rejuvenated with the opening of A Friend at Hand, the Duke of York, the Dark Horse, and the Harp Bar, which all were owned by the same person. And she told me that over at A Friend at Hand, they were actually going to expand out and create a separate bottle museum, since they were definitely running out of room. Then she showed me these silver poles that were sticking out of the ground about waist high. Each had its own icon on the top. And one was the Harp of Erin, which she said stood for government and industry. Then there were a set of pot stills, and of course that's about the area's whiskey heritage. And there were bananas. I don't remember what the bananas were for. Then we walked down Dunbar Street, and she showed me where the old McConnell's warehouse used to be. There's nothing there now, and the warehouse was lost in a huge fire in the second decade of the 20th century. And it wasn't too long after that that the original McConnell's business died out. What's interesting is she said that McConnell's once owned a distillery in Scotland, the Old Orkney Distillery. I've got so much to learn about the history of whiskey on these two islands. She said she figured they opened one there because the McConnells actually were Ulster Scots, so Scotland was part of their heritage. As we continued walking, she asked me if I wanted to go grab a drink somewhere, and I said sure. And while we were chatting on the way, I told her about my first trip to Ireland, where I had gone through the south and into Dublin, and my whole mission was to find the best Guinness in Ireland. Well, she took me to a curious brick flatiron building that I had noticed earlier during my walk around town, with a black stripe around that had the words Biddle's Bar written on it. She asked me if I wanted a Guinness. I said sure. So we walked in. It was a little bit cramped at first. There was a sea of activity, even though it was 11 a.m. on a Friday. She told me about the proprietor, John, and how he could be a little bit quirky at times, but I was sitting there thinking almost of the Seinfeld No Soup for You guy, but the two of them had a really nice conversation as he started to pull those beautiful Guinness drafts. Then she handed me that beautiful black and tan beer. I took a sip, and oh wow, I gotta tell you, I almost melted. In all of my travels, I had no idea that the best Guinness I ever would taste would come from Belfast. Oh, was it good? It was like a combination of chocolate and you could almost taste malted milk balls in it. It was so malty. And there wasn't a hint of bitter. Man, it drank like a dream. We went over and sat in a booth that was surrounded by plexiglass shields, a little remnant of the COVID era. I told her that I had stopped off at Blinkers downtown for breakfast and that my hangover was just a minor irritation. It was surprising, actually, especially after a couple of beers, cocktails, and a few cask-strength whiskeys. Alcohol mixing usually doesn't go very well for me. She asked me if I'd had the Guinness 0.0. I said I really hadn't wanted to try it because I'd had near beers before and was not impressed by them. It was interesting because even John Teeling mentioned them, although since John doesn't drink alcohol, I guess you couldn't really get an apple-to-apple comparison with his experience, but she said it was pretty good. We talked over whiskey taxes, and I mentioned how much cheaper Irish whiskey was in the States. She said, yeah, actually in Europe, the taxes aren't quite so high, so when you're in Europe, you'll see that Irish whiskey is a little less expensive as well, but in Ireland, prices get a little high. And then we all of a sudden started talking about some other distilleries. She was asking me about my trip and all the different places I was going. And just like with Michael over at Boan, she was giving me all bits of information about these distilleries I knew nothing about. And she told me about Limavady and Daryl McNally and Titanic. It's like, wow. It just was like, my list is getting incredibly long here. It was great hearing how much pride she had in what was going on in Northern Ireland in terms of the distilling industry. Then she talked about McConnell's big plans and said that, yes, they were in the process of securing a building for a distillery, but she told me I had to promise that I wouldn't say anything about the distillery location if she revealed it to me because the paperwork hadn't been signed yet and she didn't want to jinx anything. And so it wasn't until I returned home from my trip that the official announcement came out that it was being put at the Crumlin Road Jail. And when she talked about this location, it was really, really interesting because, she said it was a jail that had been used for suffragettes, but that, it really got known as a jail that was used for the citizens of Belfast who were arrested during the Troubles. And what was amazing was how she talked about the families in the area and how many of them had been touched by that prison, and that they really wanted to use it as a place to educate people about Belfast's past. Again, my lack of knowledge about the specifics of the events there, I know about the Catholics and the Protestants and all the troubles that were going on there, but what really brought it home to me was on my plane flight home, I got to watch a movie called Belfast. And if you haven't seen it, it's a movie that was just released a couple of years ago with Dame Judi Dench in it. And it's a chilling story about the struggles of a neighborhood during the Troubles. And it's a very emotional movie. I highly recommend that one. I confided in her that I definitely had an ignorance of Irish history, and she said not to worry, that she kind of had a blind spot herself over American history. When we talked about the whiskeys on the shelf at Biddle's, it's kind of funny. She said that Bushmills actually doesn't really sell there as much as you would think. It's probably because they have just a really big selection of whiskey. Apparently, there's less concern over this whole Catholic and Protestant whiskey thing. So I saw Method of Madness and Jameson, and all of those southern whiskeys were on the shelf. So it's great to hear that. And it really showed me that there was a new age evolving thanks to that long ago settled Good Friday agreement. Now, while I was there, I heard some murmurings that there were some cracks in that agreement. But hopefully, as Abraham Lincoln said, that people will bow to the better angels of their nature, and overall, hopefully, that is settled. As we finished our drinks, we got up and started walking towards another pub called Madden's. I mentioned on the way that I was going to end my trip in Dublin and was going to bar 1661, and she said, "Oh man, you got to have a Belfast coffee." I thought, "Isn't that interesting? I'm going to Dublin to go have a Belfast coffee." But I definitely locked it away in my mind. As we got to Madden's, I was introduced to Brian. She was dropping off some McConnell's Sherry Oak samples and some branded supplies. And we all got into a discussion about all the new distilleries, and that's when I learned about a distillery called Glens of Antrim and a whiskey called Lear, which was a whiskey named after King Lear. And I thought, oh man, that's right up the road. Maybe I will go check that out. It's supposed to be associated with a potato factory, so that would be interesting. Maybe I could hit that before I got to Bushmills. As I sipped it, I said, man, this is really good. It's got some nice toffee notes in it. I asked Sarah how much she knew about the old McConnell's distillery, the namesake of their modern brand. She said, well, even resident Irish historian Fionnán O'Connor really wasn't finding much information on it, even though its history dates all the way back to 1776. I did a little sleuthing myself, and I was having some trouble finding it too, but then I discovered that the distillery had a different name, so I'll keep digging into that. We walked back to the Duke of York afterwards, and there was a wedding reception going on, and apparently Sarah knew who the bride was. We walked in and sat down, and I was just marveling at the amazing historic mirrors that were hanging about the place. All authentic whiskey mirrors from the 19th and 20th centuries. We sat back and sipped one more Guinness and finished up our chat, and before I knew it, it was time to call it a day. I thank Sarah. She is a wonderful host, and I really appreciate her spending the time, and also McConnell's allowing her to wander around the town with me and help me get much more familiar with Belfast. It's a great place, and I really do look forward to my next trip there. It was time to continue my journey, and my week in Belfast and Northern Ireland was coming quickly to a close. I was going to head up and see if I could find that Glens of Antrim distillery project, and then head to the historic Bushmills distillery the next day, and then an evening walk on the Giant's Causeway. But before then, it was time to grab some dinner, soak in the last few moments of Belfast. A fantastic day, and definitely a Friday the 13th to remember. I'm Drew Hanish, and this is Whiskey Lore. Whiskey Lore is a production of Travel Fuels Life, LLC. Production, stories, and research by Drew Hanish. If you want to learn about McConnell's and all the distilleries in Ireland and Northern Ireland, or if you want to draw up your own dream vacation of visiting Irish distilleries, well, grab a copy of my new book, Whiskey Lore's Travel Guide to Experiencing Irish Whiskey, which features all of the information you need to plan and prepare for an incredible trip to the Emerald Isle, including travel tips and full profiles of 27 distilleries and information on 24 more that are on the way, just like McConnell's. Just head to whiskey-lore.com/Irish book for a quick link to Amazon, or ask your favorite bookseller or distillery to order you a copy. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Drew Hanish, and until next time, cheers and Slainte. For show notes, transcripts, and more, head to whiskey-lore.com.